My name is Tony Kronman. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and on behalf of the several sponsors of this program, I would like to welcome all of you to the Yale Law School on this transparently beautiful spring morning. Transatlantic perspectives on sovereignty and intervention, that's our subject today, and it is a topic, or really a family of topics, that could not be more urgent and timely. I'm grateful to the several groups that have collaborated in sponsoring this event. The program in International Security Studies here at Yale, the World Affairs Forum of Stanford, the Yale Law School, and the Foreign Policy Association. The Foreign Policy Association, since its creation in 1918, has been doing and continues to do as much as any organization in this country to bring informed discussion and debate of the critical foreign policy issues that face America to the attention of a wider public. And I'd just like to note that and to appreciate the work of the association, and to recognize in particular my long and dear friend Noel Lateef, who I've known since his student days here at Yale a while back, and to welcome Noel and his board members here to the law school today. The modern state system, which today, of course, we largely take for granted as the accepted backdrop for all of our thinking about international relations generally and American foreign policy in particular, is of course a historical invention. Indeed, it is a European invention. The state system that now shapes our thinking about all fundamental issues of international politics and law had its beginnings on the European peninsula not all that long ago in historical terms. It isn't more than 450 years old, which relatively speaking puts it in its infancy when you compare the state system to other forms of political organization, empires, for example. The nation-state system in its classical form rested and continues to rest on several key assumptions. And I'd like to mention just two of these because these are the two that are under such stress and challenge today, and whose stressed condition raises the issues that will be at the center of today's program. One critical assumption of the state system is that states enjoying, as Max Weber once put it, a monopoly of the instruments of legitimate violence within the territories they control, have the undisputed right to deal with their own citizens, and indeed more generally with all of those resident within their territory, as they see fit, as they think best, free of meddling interference from other states. Each state has a near perfect and insulated power of disposal when it comes to determining the rights and privileges of citizens living within its own territory. So in the French state, it is the French government which decides how the French are to be treated, and in Germany, the German government that decides how the Germans will be treated, and so on and so forth. We might call this the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. A second key assumption. The primary threat to the stability and security of the state system has been understood from the very start to be state-organized forms of violence. Indeed, one of the motives for the creation of the state system in the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe was the emergence of new forms of state-based violence which simply eclipsed in their power and effectiveness all previous types and techniques of military organization. The primary threat, as I say, to the stability of the state system was understood to be state-organized violence. And so the greatest danger to one state was the deployment of force against it by another state. A foundational principle of the state system has been from the start no aggressive state-sponsored violence by one state against another, no aggressive wars. Now, both of these assumptions, as I say, are under stress today from different directions. The first, the principle of non-interference, is centrally challenged by the human rights movement and indeed by the whole movement toward an increasingly cosmopolitan conception of human rights and human justice that begins with Nuremberg at the end of the Second World War. The simple thought at the heart of the human rights movement is this: men and women everywhere, regardless of where they happen accidentally to reside, in France or Germany or the United States or Rwanda or the former Yugoslav Republic, have fundamental privileges and entitlements that no state may take away from them or deny them or interfere with. Rights which other states have the privilege and indeed perhaps even the moral obligation to protect when they are threatened by the state in which an individual or group happens to reside. To protect these rights, intervention in the internal affairs of a state threatening them or compromising them is justified on moral and political grounds. That is a thought which begins to gather momentum with Nuremberg and today is a deeply fixed premise of the human rights movement, which is as significant and influential a movement as any in the world today. Secondly, the assumption that the most dangerous and threatening forms of violence are state-organized and state-sponsored violence can no longer be subscribed to today with the same confidence that it has been for the last 350 or 400 years. Terrorism is perhaps the most dramatic and challenging example of a form of violence that is deeply threatening to the stability of states, but is not itself state-organized. It may be state-sheltered, state-aided, but a terrorist band is not necessarily and typically isn't an instrumentality of state power. How do states protect themselves against violence of that kind? The old prohibition against aggressive war, which made a great deal of sense in the classical state system, may not be well adapted to the world we live in today with its new forms of state-threatening violence. And it is from concerns like this that, of course, we get the Bush doctrine of preemption and much else besides. So there is a lot to talk about here, just a lot to talk about, and how appropriate that we take these questions up, sovereignty and intervention, in a transatlantic perspective, given the natal source of the state system, which is at the center of all of these deep and perplexing questions. Noel has asked to say a few words before we start with our first panel this morning, and I would like now to invite him to come to the rostrum and to join me in welcoming you here today. I know you're going to have an absolutely fascinating time. My only regret, and it is quite intense, is that I can't just come and sit down and enjoy the rest of the day with you. But alas, I can't. I have to scoot off to another event momentarily, but I'm glad I was able at least to be here to welcome you this morning. No.
Well, you can see why I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to have Dean Kronman as a teacher. He taught me contracts law, and I always look back fondly on that experience. That was a wonderful overview of our conference today, and I just thought I might take a few minutes to say a few things about the conference and how it got put together. The subject, as Dean Kronman said, is Transatlantic Perspectives on Sovereignty and Intervention, which reminds me of a conversation between two UN ambassadors in their high-rise in New York City. It seems that as they were getting in the lift, they could not help overhearing a very heated argument behind closed doors. They quickly consulted with one another on whether to intervene. They concluded that it was a private matter and that it would be wrong to step in. The lift stopped on another floor, and this time they heard what sounded like a gunshot from behind closed doors. Should they intervene, they asked each other. Again, they concluded that it would be inappropriate to meddle in others' affairs. The lift stopped on yet another floor, and this time they could see thick white smoke curling from underneath the apartment door. Should they intervene? If we don't, one ambassador said to the other, the entire building could go up in smoke. And intervene they did. I leave to you the lessons to be drawn from this exchange, but I can't resist observing that the when and where and why for intervention varies widely depending on a host of variables. Would our ambassadors have reacted differently were they related to the protagonists or friendly with them? And this is my segue to transatlantic perspectives. The world has rarely seen as productive an alliance as the transatlantic one. A task force chaired by Henry Kissinger and Larry Summers concluded in their recently released final report, the accomplishments of the Atlantic Alliance are remarkable. History records few, if any, alliances that have yielded so many benefits for their members or for the broader international community. Despite these accomplishments, the transatlantic relationship is under great strain today, greater than at any point in at least a generation. The war in Iraq brought these strains to the point of crisis. So I concur with Dean Kronman that against this backdrop, our town hall today could not be more timely. Before I turn the floor to the moderator of our first panel, I'd like to thank Dean Kronman and the Yale Law School for hosting us in this spectacular auditorium. I'd like to acknowledge a Yale undergraduate, Noah Hyman, who conceptualized today's program and worked hard to make it happen. And on the Foreign Policy Association side, I'd like to thank Michael Lucevera for providing critical support. To our board member, Elbrun Kimmelman, I'd like to thank her for making some key introductions which led to this event. And very much want to thank the members of the board who are here, Mary Belknap, Judy Biggs, for taking the time to be with us. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Herford Foundation and the Center for International Security Studies at Yale. The latter is making possible a lunch in the courtyard of the law school today. And I'd like to also acknowledge the World Affairs Council of Stanford for participating. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Charles Hill, diplomat in residence here at Yale, who will moderate our first panel on sovereignty, security, and the right to intervene. Charles.
Thank you, Noel, and thanks to Dean Kronman for these very informative and I think essential introductory remarks that are foundational to the things we'll be talking about here. I'll introduce our three very distinguished panelists in the order that they appear in my program and ask them to speak in that order. Like them to have 15 or so minutes, or any part of that they would like, to put their presentations forward, and then leaving, I think, plenty of time for questions thereafter before we break for lunch. The Honorable Lawrence Korb served as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the 1980s, and then Director for Public Policy at the Brookings Institution until 1998, after which he became Vice President and Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. At present, he is Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and a noted commentator on defense and international security affairs. Ambassador Jones Parry trained originally as a theoretical physicist with degrees from Cardiff and Cambridge. In turning to diplomacy, he served in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, becoming political director, a very important position, in 1998. After serving as ambassador to NATO, he became and now serves as Her Majesty's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. Ambassador Adamantios Vassilakis is the ambassador of Greece to the United Nations. He knows the United States well from his tour of duty as Consul General of Greece in San Francisco in the 1980s, and since then has held a series of important diplomatic positions for his government at the United Nations, at the European Union in Brussels, at the Foreign Ministry in Athens, before returning to the United Nations as Greece's permanent representative in 2002, and in that role he still serves. So with that, I would like to invite Lawrence Korb to start us off.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And in my remarks, I'd like to do a couple of things. I try and explain the American perspective, and in particular, the perspective of the Bush administration when it comes to dealing with these very critical subjects. One of the things you have to understand about the United States is that many times people think the debate when it comes to foreign policy is between isolationism and engagement. And that's really not true. The United States, ever since its founding a couple hundred years ago, has always been involved in the world. If you know the Marine Corps hymn, and they talk about from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, that was in the administration of Thomas Jefferson that we went there. The debate really has been between when you get involved in the world, do you do it unilaterally or multilaterally? That really is the big debate. And you see it being played out today as we try and confront the world as it's changed since September 11th. Now, while it's not exactly true, but the Republican Party leans more toward the unilateral pole, and the Democratic Party more toward the multilateral pole. Obviously, there are individuals who have different perspectives, but if you look historically, and you look particularly now since the end of the Cold War and since September 11th, I think you'll find that the motto of the Republican Party as personified by the Bush administration is unilateral if we can, multilateral only if we must. Whereas the Democrats would say multilateral if we can, unilateral only if we talk for a few minutes about what the Bush administration would say about the subjects that we're dealing with today. They would argue that the world fundamentally changed on September 11, 2001, and that the United States had to adopt a new strategy, which they would call preventive war. And they would say that this preventive war has basically three components. First of all, that the United States has the right to intervene to protect its security against terrorists, states who support them, and rogue states or outlaw states who try and get weapons of mass destruction. And it would be nice if we could get the rest of the world to go along with us, if we could get the United Nations to sanction it, but the United States simply can't wait, because the United States is the target of terrorists and states that support them and states that try to acquire weapons of mass destruction because of who we are and who we represent. And so therefore the United States needs to be able to wage preventive war against any of those three enemies. And that the United States can by itself determine when it is under threat. And that the United States basically will only act for the good of the world. Therefore, when we take this action of preventive war, it is based upon what people call American exceptionalism. And if you listen to President Bush's speeches and even his recent press conference on April 13th, you will see these aspects coming through when he talks about the values that we hold are not God's gift to the American people, but God's gift to humanity. Now, the second aspect of the Bush strategy is exemplified to deal with the world after September 11th is the United States must be militarily dominant. We cannot allow another nation to challenge us militarily, and we need to do that so that we can protect our security by waging these preventive wars if we must. And also, the United States, again, would only act for the world's good, so therefore having this power will allow us to shape the world in a way that will be good for all of the world. And then finally, the United States, in order to deal with the long-term causes of terrorism, not only has to follow Woodrow Wilson's admonition to make the world safe for democracy, but the United States actually has to make the world democratic. In other words, it's one step beyond Wilson, and the idea is that if you have democracies, free market democracies, this will deal with the long-term causes of terrorism. People will not become foot soldiers with these terrorists and seek to do these horrible things if they have the opportunities that we have in the United States. And that's pretty much their view, and some would ascribe it to the neoconservatives. If you read Bob Woodward's book, this is a view held by most strongly people like Vice President Cheney, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, and the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Now, there's another argument going on, and you see it among somebody in the Bush administration, and that's Secretary Powell. You see it in the Senate with people like Senators Lugar and Hagel, and I think you see it represented also by the Democratic Party as personified by Senator Kerry. And this group would argue that, yes, the United States has the right to take military action against a terrorist who doesn't belong to a particular state and who cannot be deterred by traditional means, providing you have elegant intelligence. That's a phrase that Rumsfeld used in a speech in Europe. But you better be darn sure you have good intelligence, because if you wage one of these wars or you take preemptive action and you don't have good intelligence, you risk setting a new standard of international behavior. Because if it's okay for the United States to go to Iraq, what's to prevent India from going after Pakistan or to prevent China from taking action against Taiwan. They would also argue that the United States, can deter established states, even rogue states, because even a horrible ruler like a Saddam Hussein or Kim Jong-il of North Korea would be deterred from taking action or using a weapon of mass destruction against the United States because they know that that would be the end of their regime, and in fact that they would have something to lose. And they point out that we were able to deter and contain the Soviet Union even under Stalin, and China under Mao Zedong. And they are also concerned about this idea of spreading democracy around the world because it might lead the United States to overextend itself and put itself in a position where the American people would get tired of bearing this burden and not even provide for what's really necessary for national security. And then you have a third view, I would call liberal internationalism, though we're not allowed to use that term anymore. I never understand why it's come into such repute. And that gets to the human rights groups, people who work with those who would say, look, if you want to deal with the situation that led to what happened on September 11th, basically you need to rely on other nations and on non-military aspects, dry up their financial assets, share intelligence, work with law enforcement agencies. And you also ought to spend more money on things like foreign aid and dealing with the causes of poverty, hunger, and disease, and also work more with the international community on things like the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other international arrangements that help in dealing with this, because the United States, as powerful as it is, can't win it on its own. The United States may be preponderant, but it's not omnipotent.
Thank you very much, Lawrence Korb. Next, we'll ask Ambassador Jones-Parry to speak.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman, and it's a great privilege to be here. You're probably wondering what on earth is a physicist doing trying to cope with diplomatic questions, but I'll do my best, as I've been much longer a diplomat than I ever was a physicist. I start on the basis that the world we live in is a very different place now to what it was pre-89. Pre-1989, we dealt with certainties. Life was wonderful. My predecessors in NATO, I'm sure, used to come in, read the telegrams, look out the window, Russians aren't coming today, let's go and play golf. There was a certainty about life. After 1989, nothing is certain. The nature of conflict has changed. More and more is intrastate. Life is much more exciting, but it's much more difficult. We look back at the 90s. We've got some, I think by the end, some considerable successes in the case of the way we handled Kosovo and the demise of Milosevic. But there are some glaring, really very bad experiences. We allowed Sarajevo to be shelled and under siege for 12 to 15 months. Rwanda happened. Liberia contaminated West Africa. We've got now peacekeeping operations in Liberia, Ivory Coast, and Sierra Leone, precisely because nobody was prepared to do very much about President Taylor. You look at those cases, and you wonder whether today the need for a willingness to intervene is greater than it was. I'm unashamedly of the view that more and more, in order to protect human rights, to stand up for human dignity, but above all, to avoid humanitarian disaster, you have to be in the business of intervening. But you have to do so in a very precise and legal way. In terms of the UN Charter, there is a tension. The tension is between the sovereignty of states, the right not to be interfered with, Article 2.7 and so on, and yet the sense that under certain circumstances, there can be an intervention. The old days, based on the Treaty of Westphalia, assumed the sovereignty of a nation-state. But in the case of Britain, sovereignty is something which is really quite different today to what it was, say, 50 years ago. We belong to the European Union. We have willingly shared sovereignty with 14 other countries, and from next month, i.e. in 3 days, we will share it with 24 other countries. And we do so on the basis that sharing sovereignty, doing things on a multilateral basis, applying supranational law, brings to us precise benefits. We can cope better with problems. We have more economic advantages. We believe our foreign policy is stronger for that dimension. So we give up sovereignty. And yet, sovereignty in another sense is an illusion. We have economic sovereignty. We set our own interest rates because we're not actually within the euro at the moment. But the British sovereignty, the right to set our own interest rates, is determined really by the market. And if the market moves in a particular way, within hours, the British interest rates have followed. There are real limitations. That's the world we live in. But the sense that sovereignty is no longer absolute, that it is constrained, is also reflected in the Charter of the United Nations, because the right to intervene, to use force, is also indeed set out, but under very careful conditions. The right of self-defense, the right of the Security Council to take action under certain circumstances to preserve international peace and security. I have a problem with intervention in the sense that intervention is too often associated with a military intervention, and I'll come back to the military. But I do want to stress this, that intervention is much more than deploying military force. It's part preventative, it's part deterrent, but it's also a range of different instruments. The United Nations, for example, authorizes military deployments under direct UN authority, normally a peacekeeping mandate. That's one form of intervention. It can authorize a member state or a group of member states to take military action, as in the case of the Gulf War. But what about conflict prevention? What about the range of instruments, the encouragement through development assistance, through institutional building, through police, through developing the judiciary, trying to develop the rule of law in countries on the basis that if you have rule of law, you're more likely to be democratic, and if you're democratic, you're less likely to be involved either in repression or in external conflict. The diplomatic effort between states, the good offices of the Secretary General of the United Nations, the protective intervention, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, what UNICEF does, all those are interventions. The International Court of Justice intervenes. The tribunals we set up in Rwanda and in the former Yugoslavia represent another form of intervention. They all have their place. My simple theory is that what we require is a coherence of intervention from conflict prevention through to stopping conflict, to actually stabilization, to policing, to building peace, establishing the rule of law, and working at that consistently, not necessarily in that sequence, but with the intention, very simply, of taking you through at the end to democratic, peace-abiding, stable states that can prosper, that can offer a degree of human dignity and economic development to the citizens. But if I come back to military force, self-defense is obvious in the sense if you've just been attacked. Less easy, of course, is the case of the prospect of attack. It can't be the case that you can only take military action in response to something which has happened. Chapter 7 of the Charter is quite clear, talking about threats. And threats are things which may happen. They're not things which necessarily have occurred. So this need to be in a position to respond, to anticipate, must exist. The question is, how does one exercise it? In my book, as I said previously in the North Atlantic Council, self-defense is no good to me if I've just been killed. If it's quite clear that the circumstances obtain that the attack is imminent, when can one then forestall it and act? And quite clearly, in some obvious cases, one would do that. But what are the bases for it? Let me look for a moment at humanitarian intervention, the duty to protect. What do we do for our citizens? Based on my experience in the Kosovo campaign, let me set out these criteria quite specifically. That if there is convincing evidence of an extreme humanitarian distress on a large scale, requiring urgent and immediate relief, that's the condition existing. Secondly, if it's objectively clear that there's no practical alternative to the use of force if lives are to be saved, and if the proposed use of force is necessary and is proportionate to the aim and is strictly limited in time and in scope, I think under those circumstances, it's appropriate for the international community to say, or for some in the international community to say, we are prepared to act. That humanitarian law, I'm sure we could have several lawyers who would now stand up and say, that is a load of old tosh. And I could find other lawyers who would say, it is the way the world's moving, and more it is the case. It is an area of dispute, but what is, I think, quite clear is that in the way events have occurred, in the responses to situations like Kosovo, the burden of evidence has shifted so that there is now a greater acceptance that actually it is appropriate to use force under those circumstances. I think in the case of combating terrorism, where there are clear threats, and where we are less into humanitarian and more into a military threat, then the case for self-defense speaks for itself. But what is crucial in all this is that preferably one does so on a multilateral basis, agreed by Security Council. That is sometimes either not possible in terms of time, or that there is sufficient disagreement that you can't actually get the Council to act. Under each of those circumstances, I think the obligation then on states to consider very carefully whether they consider there is a legal basis to act, and in deciding to act and having acted, they should then report immediately to the Council what they have done, and then we see how we stand against the Court of International Opinion. But the preferred option, in my view, if time permits, is quite clearly to act through the Security Council. The fact that yesterday the Council enacted legislation requiring countries to take measures to stop the possible transfer of weapons of mass destruction to what we call non-state actors, i.e. to potential terrorists, and to make it illegal for such groupings to possess weapons of mass destruction, demonstrate why you need to intervene and why, under certain circumstances, where the multilateral regimes don't cover such cases and where the time it would take to do so is so great that the Council would have to act. So yesterday we did so, and I think responsibly. I'll conclude, if I may, because I was asked if I'd say something about sanctions. I prepared a few words on sanctions, and on the basis that sanctions are a particular form of intervention, let me just say this about sanctions, that where there is no alternative and where one is not doesn't have a legal basis or sufficient political support for military action, sanctions are often the only alternative. That they need to be used, in my view, flexibly, a carrot and stick approach. You need to always build in an incentive. You need to try and make sure that you are attacking the elites, the people who are taking the decisions. If you look at, say, a Myanmar, Burma situation, to make sure that you are getting at the people you ought to be getting at. And at the same time, you don't cause either direct damage to those you wish to encourage, i.e. the reformers, or indeed that you run the risk of causing consequences which you can't really anticipate, i.e. the humanitarian to the civilian population, or indeed in some cases, as in Yugoslavia, where I think we effectively knocked out the middle class in Yugoslavia by virtue of the sanctions we imposed. But that where you do put them in place, you target them, financial sanctions, arms embargoes, travel bans at the elite, those are the way forward, but that they then need to be implemented sufficiently rigorously, but actually they have effect. That applies especially as one looks at terrorism. If we're going to control financial flows to terrorism and intervene in that sense, it can only be done comprehensively by everybody. Otherwise, flows get to the weak point in the market and you are rendered totally ineffective in what you're trying to do. But in applying sanctions, as in applying intervention in general, my argument would be that it needs to be set in the widest possible policy framework, which includes the duty to protect citizens, the need to respect what states actually do, the autonomy of states, their sovereignty, up to a point. And I conclude by simply saying this. In Africa, the African Union has in many ways shown us the way forward. The Peace and Security Council set up in Africa actually provides that if a situation exists in one country which is sufficiently grave either in its humanitarian aspect or in its impact on neighbors, then by consensus -1, that is to say all the other countries belonging to the Peace and Security Council can agree military intervention over the opposition of the countries concerned. That's what the Africans themselves have had the maturity to do. It's certainly not what the UN is up to, it's not what the European Union is up to. But it is an indication of the need that more and more we have to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Emyr. We'll now turn to Ambassador Vassilakis.
Thank you very much to the organizers for including me in this panel, and it's always pleasant to be in a university environment because the youth is there, and then that makes me feel much better. In view of today's gathering, I have tried to find some relevant material. Honestly, I was confused because the number of books and articles that I have found under the subject of today's transatlantic perspectives on sovereignty and intervention, or on the particular one, security and the right to intervene, were too many. Why? I think that the subject is very interesting, has become very sexy, I would say, in our days, and I would say that too many wish to offer their views. In fact, my conclusion is that the subject is very complicated, and there is not only one view, but many, and these views are varying according to the existing situations. In the past, we were saying that the French raison d'etat was prevailing, but I have to remind that even the states are directed by human beings, and therefore the personal feelings of each one of us is always included. It all depends where you stand. If you are from a big state, for a medium one or for a small one, where you live, what your values are, what your priorities are. The situation becomes even more complicated if in these questions you add your goals, your aspirations. The questions becomes even more complicated if we start discussing the means one wishes to use in order to reach his or her goals. Therefore, I will try to give you my perspective based on my own experience and my observations from my involvement in international relations and more specifically in multilateral organizations. There is a basic question. Are we peace-loving people? My answer is yes. And I think that a priori we can say that we all are loving people. We all agree that the purposes and principles contained in the first article of the UN Charter are acceptable to all. Why then we are discussing today the right to intervene? Obviously because some do not respect these principles and in fact, in a very different way, they don't try to observe the rules or the existing rules, the treaties, the principles, the practices, because individuals or groups of individuals do not respect any kind of principles or rules. And here we have another basic question. Is there a right to intervene? It may appear simplistic. I personally think that it is more simple than we want to believe by creating many theories. If I had to answer, my answer would be a clear yes, because we are all want peace. When we can intervene, but when we are acting in self-defense. The Article 51 of the UN Charter is clear. Nobody can challenge that. The question becomes even more complicated when we have to face situations that are threatening. But again, threatening what? Our way of life, our principles, our interest? As we all understand, the answer to these questions will also depend on what our perceptions are. I will give you an example. During the Iraqi war, in the States, you had a view coming from the TV channels in this country. In Europe, you had another view, and in the Arab world, another view. So what is the truth in this case? I can go on and asking questions. They may give uncertainties, they may give to certain incentives to write more articles and more books. Let me tell you how a representative from a small country thinks as we may answer to all these questions. First, I think I would like to describe what are the various threats that we face. Putting them on a piece of paper is not always easy. The first that came to our mind is terrorism, but there are many threats. Second, we have to consider the roots of these situations that created these threats. It is important to know the reasons why a specific situation is creating a threat. I will give you an example. The situation in the Balkans was not always good. As a matter of policy, Greece tried to find the roots in order to see how we can improve the relations with all our neighbors, and I think we are successful. Third, assuming that we agree on the previous questions, we have to establish criteria for the use of force. Criteria global in nature, so we all know the rules of the game. I believe I can say, without being misinterpreted, that one cannot fight violence with violence. In cases where recourse to the use of force seems to be unavoidable, we need to establish clear and consistent international rules to this effect, be sanctions, be violations of human rights. We have to know how to act. Last but not least, we have to choose the means to this end. Here again, the opinions vary, and there are too many. I will offer a few, but I can accept that there are other means that one can use. Multilateral cooperation is one very useful instrument. I would say go as much as possible multilateral. We have to encourage and implement strong policies of conflict prevention. When we see there is a situation which is worsening, we have to try to help in advance. We have to address definitely the question of weapons of mass destruction, and this is what my colleague from UK mentioned with the resolution that the Security Council took yesterday. It is very important, and as well, we have to face terrorism. We have to create effective mechanism for the EU and the United States to work together. In my view, there is no foolproof formula. We need a strategy that will systematically address the root causes of conflicts using a broad range of tools in different ways and different combinations. We have to encourage participation in international activities by building a dense network of shared interests and mutual commitments. If we succeed to have all the member states of the UN or all the countries of the world involved, then this is the only way that they all will feel that they participate in some common effort. Having these guiding principles in order to have global security, democracy, tolerance, and human rights. As the subject of security and the right to intervention is in the broader transatlantic relations, I would say that the situation that has been created with the war in Iraq is a situation that is a normal between, you have differences between friends and allies. It was difficult to face the situation, but I think time is a healer, and slowly all this situation will evolve positively. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to all three panelists for very serious and professional, insightful presentations. We now have time for questions, and for your convenience and also for better hearing, there are microphones set up in the aisles. I would like to, from this position, claim the right to ask the first question for any or all of the panelists as they may wish. And to set that against Dean Kronman's remarks at the outset when he spoke of the international state system that goes back to Westphalia and has the elements in it of the state sovereignty, international law, international organizations such as the UN, professional militaries, norms of universal human rights, and so on. And against that, referred to indications in recent years that the intellectuals of the system itself, the intelligentsia, may have concluded that perhaps this system is a bit outmoded, that sovereignty has been diminished by globalization, that the state perhaps is not what it used to be, and we look toward NGOs and toward larger supra-state entities. That perhaps is there a weakening of the commitment to the international system from within? And then secondly, looking at the back pages of the New York Times, the many, it seems, cases of thwarted terrorist attacks that you might think are interventions into the international state system. Such things as in Jordan, apparently chemical weapons being used there or plotted. Syria, cells discovered and rolled up in Europe, elsewhere around the world. Is this some kind of a challenge systemically to the international state system from without? That's a long question, but I guess to sum it up, is the system that we are discussing here today and the tools that it has for intervention, is that system itself being fundamentally challenged?
Refer to the ambassadors, or?
No, you start.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's no doubt about the fact that the system has changed, and it's kind of a paradox. It's changing almost in two ways, as was mentioned here in terms of globalization. We're breaking down borders. One of the things is that political geography has not kept up with economic geography, and I think that's very, 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 very important. I mean, you see, for example, people upset about globalization, and they don't know who to protest because there's nobody they can get to act. I mean, in terms of, it's one thing to elect your representative or your senator or the president, but it's another thing to decide who's on the WTO when they make a decision that has an impact on you. So that's one way that it's changing. I think the United States has been one of the last to recognize that. I think Europeans, with the European Union, they've ceded a lot of sovereignty to the union representatives. I mean, in Europe, they can decide what is pasta and what is beer. That's a decision that's not made by the individual nations, that's made by the Commission. We had the big battle in the United States about gays in the military. The British had agreed with us, but yet when a European court decided that this violated human rights in Europe, the British actually changed their policy. The United States obviously has decided not to. On the other hand, as was mentioned, these transnational groups, many states don't seem to be able to control them, and because they can't, then they in effect have ceded sovereignty, and the international community has to act. And I think the real challenge is, can you develop a consensus in the international community to deal with these situations where states are not able to do what they used to? And I think that's basically the debate we saw play out, for example, in Iraq. Compare what happened in Afghanistan to what happened in Iraq. In Afghanistan, you had NATO invoking Article 5, you had the UN authorizing what happened, and the United States, after warning the Taliban to turn over Al-Qaeda, went in with the approval of the international community. We have NATO peacekeeping forces in there, and we also have a lot of aid from other countries, financial, compared to Iraq, where you did not let the international system play out, and you have a completely different situation.
Can I stress from a European viewpoint that if the Commission is to decide what is pasta, as was just said, there's a reason for that, and the reason is that if the Commission, having decided that something is pasta or that it's wine under a particular appellation or whatever, I, as the producer of pasta, am then able to sell that pasta without any impediment in 14 other countries. That's the reason why we do it. We're not trading sovereignty and national freedom just to give it up. We're actually accepting that there's a huge benefit as a result of doing it. I don't think the state system is disintegrating. I think it remains, and from the viewpoint of the United Kingdom, we take our statehood very seriously. But I do think the way in which we manifest and the extent of our sovereignty, I think that is being modified. It's being modified by a series of factors, but they include the fact that non-state actors, the terrorists of this world and others, have an increasing role, effect on our lives, that no single state can actually cope with the problem. There's no single state answer to Al-Qaeda. What you need is a multilateral, collective response. The fact that non-governmental actors, the NGOs, have an increasing role in what happens in our societies, that too needs to be reflected. But let me pick up one point which hasn't come up particularly yet, and that's failing states. This idea, if sovereignty is absolute, what do you do about the state which is clearly at a point of failure? It's quite clear what you do with those that have failed. Those you try and pick up the pieces and the UN intervenes. But where a state is either abusing its own citizens or is a potential major perturbation to its neighbors, or more widely, what do you do about it? Let me share with you, I was in a discussion in London back in November, and I was arguing the case that we needed an early warning system for such countries and a degree of involvement. And what I said in my earlier intervention, across the spectrum, stopping conflict, trying to build up the democratic, the judicial institutions within states so that they don't collapse. I said I would like a list of such countries so we can actually start working in the UN on them. And one of my colleagues from the Treasury, predictably it had to be the Treasury, said that's fine, but I think we should concentrate on those countries where the United Kingdom has a direct interest. And my response is very simple. Yes, just as in 1991, we in London concluded that we had no longer any direct interest in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, most of the world reached the same conclusion. We paid the price desperately in 2001. And the truth is, if you don't go to Afghanistan, the Afghanistans come to you. So the lesson is you can't afford the prospect of failing states. You have to, in my view, set up an international system prepared to intervene constructively to stop the crisis before it emerges. Of course, we've got to take the cases, the basket cases, and pick them up and do our utmost there. But it's far better to have prevented rather than be working on the cure.
You saw that you have two different views. Now you are going to hear a third one. The world is a living organism, we like it or not. What existed in the 19th century is not anymore valid in the 20th. The nation-state that existed continues to exist. But we cannot ignore that with globalization, we have a number of cross-cutting issues. This is a new jargon that we were not using in the years before. We cannot ignore that. Now, there are some states that are able to afford to face these problems by themselves. There are others that cannot do. So what is important is to have cooperation, and this is what is happening in Europe. Now, you have the weapons of mass destruction, you have the problem of drugs, you have the women's trafficking, you have the violation of human rights. All that is something that we have to find ways how to face them. Now, how you do and how you classify these issues that we have to face collectively. This is a difficult issue, and I think it's only through the international cooperation, by enhancing the multilateral system, that we will be able to face them. And how enhance it? Participation, I think, is the best rule to follow. Thank you.
Thank you all. Now to questions from the floor. Again, you may address one or more of our panelists. Here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Sekou Bete from City College, New York. I have two questions, or one, if you know, is addressed to all the panel. In the past, we have seen intervention for humanitarian reasons. Today, we are seeing preemptive attack for, I could say, self-interest reason. So how do you reconcile this notion, this concept with the notion of sovereignty? So do you think today's sovereignty has any more meaning?
Anyone?
Sovereignty. You love sovereignty.
I do think sovereignty has meaning, and I don't think there's an inconsistency. But there are limitations on our sovereignty, laid down by the Charter, laid down the whole question of self-defense. And self-defense, I'm not going to get into doctrine on this, but what I regard as anticipatory self-defense under certain circumstances must be justifiable. I'll give you this stark case. Between the awful conception in Afghanistan, the planning in Hamburg, the execution as planes took off in the United States to the moment that those planes actually hit their targets. Had the United States, with good authority, known what was going to happen at any of those stages, does anybody really believe the US would not have been entitled to intervene militarily? My argument's very clear. And the doctrine considered by NATO and by other countries is simple, that if such an attack is in the process of taking place, you're actually entitled to take military action to stop it. But that's stark, that's black and white. The problem in life is that most of the cases we deal with are not like that. And it's a bit like the elephant. When you see it, you know what you've got. But actually, there are many cases which are so grey. What we have to do is try and address them all case by case. I could try and put forward a doctrine as to when one could intervene. I sought to do it earlier on the humanitarian. It's much more difficult on self-defense. And I think at the end, you've got to go by the Charter and an assumption that case by case, you can actually see what you need to do, and if necessary, you act. I don't think it's the end of sovereignty. I do think more and more, unfortunately, in this world, there are necessary steps that you need to take either for self-defense or to cover the humanitarian cases. But when we're talking about humanitarian cases, again, if you follow the logic of conflict prevention, of stopping humanitarian distress as it unfolds, it's quite clear to the non-governmental organization working in the field, to the agencies of the UN trying to distribute food, actually to bring relief, to those looking at human rights, you can see there are various indicators which tell you that a country is at a stage where we should be seriously worried about it. The problem is that as for alcoholics, the big step is to stand up and say, I am failing. And few states are prepared to do that. And if a state isn't, the convention is very clear in the Security Council. We don't put it on the agenda. And we've, in the last 6 weeks, discussed 2 countries, under any other business, it has to be said, under humanitarian reports on the situation in those countries. But we have directly focused on the politics and real situations of distress, and where 95% of certain regions have been internally displaced. 1.5 million people in one case internally displaced. We're trying to get at that. Does it infringe sovereignty? Up to a point. Is it justified? In my view, very clearly, yes.
Make a point, and I think the ambassador made a terrific point about anticipatory self-defense, and that's really preemption. Nobody would disagree with that a state having good information would not be justified in acting. But preventive war, and it is a different concept. And if you go back and you take a look at the debate on Iraq, everybody was very clear to say it wasn't an imminent threat. And therefore, if it's not an imminent threat, the real question then is, by what authority do you deal with it? And if you believe in the UN Charter and international law, then of course you're supposed to take your case to the world body to get that approval. And the historians will argue whether the United States and its coalition partners were acting under UN resolutions or whether they needed a second, but I think that's the real key issue. And I thought it was fascinating that after people said to the president, well, you claimed it was an imminent threat because of weapons of mass destruction and the ties to al-Qaeda, that didn't turn out to be true. He said, no, I never said it was an imminent threat. And then he turned out and said, no, we were really doing it for humanitarian reasons. So I think that's clouding the picture, and somehow or another we need to separate that out if we're going to move forward and establish new norms for the world community to deal with these threats, whether they're from terrorists or failed states.
I would like to have a very shorter answer. Is the sovereignty has still a meaning? I would say yes. But we have to know that there are new realities in the world we are living. Ourselves, we were looking for X 10 years ago, and now we are looking for something different. So you have to see the situation case by case, and I think the right to intervene for humanitarian purposes is something that we all have to be very cautious, because there are states that are asking the Security Council to intervene in order to save lives. Are they going to say no? I'm not all the time in favor of the 5 permanent members who decide a number of things, but on the other side, we are asking them to do certain things. So we have to be honest with ourselves, and we have to make a judgment as objective as we can regarding the specific situation.
Yes.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm a student here at the law school, and I actually went over to Britain for 2 years just after the September 11th attacks, and I was greeted by overwhelming sympathy and goodwill, and remember the British Union Jack flag next to the Stars and Stripes. And what I noticed, at least especially among the student generation, when I left 2 years later, was a lot of that goodwill had evaporated, and there was a lot of anger, even towards me as an American student. And one of the things that struck me, I guess, was that there didn't seem to be necessarily disagreement about the Iraq War, but the lack of process that went forward. And one of the things that was kind of corollary to that was that there wasn't a sense of imminence. And I just want to come back to this comment that Mr. Korb just made, and I guess pose the question to the British ambassador in the following way. It strikes me that in cases of imminence, there is a clear need for states to intervene, and that a system that might be bureaucratic or that might temporarily disable action would be necessary to thwart. But in cases of non-imminence, it strikes me that there are a lot of places that meet the humanitarian criteria that you spoke about, because there are a lot of places where sadly there are dictators and there are rogue regimes. And so I guess my question is, if you don't think that the UN Security Council necessarily has to approve humanitarian interventions in non-imminence, a case that I understand because I think that there are a lot of difficulties in that bureaucracy, is there any process? And I say that because I think that one of the things that most engendered resentment abroad was this coalition of the willing, this idea that whoever was ready at the time to join America would make our process legitimate in our own eyes, and there was no process that we would ascribe, even outside of the UN, like NATO. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on, can we envision in the future some process in cases of non-imminence that states should have to go through, even if it's not the Security Council process?
I don't know what process we can find, but I think there is an established process that we all have to accept. If we don't accept it, then each one of us will do whatever he or she wants. Now, if you are a big state and you have the means, if you take the case of Iraq, then the United States can say, yes, this is the coalition of the willing. But you have to see how the world is thinking, and I think we have to accept the existing mechanism before we find something better. Thank you.
Sir Emyr, I think part of that question was directed toward British-American relations.
Yes.
You may duck it if you
I
wish.
think I'm tempted to pass on that particular bit of the question. No, there was a huge amount of goodwill. There are lots of things which history will record, I think, about how goodwill in Europe was dissipated. And I'm not going to go into the causes of that, but it is, I think, a fact that over time, both the goodwill and the threat factor, that Europeans, although they've lived with terrorism much longer, actually became somewhat complacent about this particular threat. And the fact of Iraq is very simple. Some of us felt, A, we had a legal basis to act, and that there was an overwhelming need to act, and others, for a range of reasons, but which included fundamental principled disagreements, actually didn't share that view. It divided the United Nations, it divided the European Union, it divided NATO, and it divided political parties it was a very divisive issue. Let me be quite clear. I would prefer to see the sorts of interventions we're talking about, if they're military, to be approved by the Security Council. That's the preferred route. If that's not attainable, then I made an earlier qualification that one should act legally. And we all have our different interpretations, perhaps, but the fundamental is that we should act legally. In terms of humanitarian law, some of us would say that gives us a basis, but it's disputed. Let me take you directly to an alternative process, what happened in Kosovo. The Security Council wasn't prepared to act, or couldn't act, because it was clear one country would veto anything that was put on the table. The North Atlantic Council in October 1998 agreed to issue an ultimatum to Milosevic, and it adopted a very wise decision, which was to say, we all agree that the ultimatum we've issued and the action we might have to take is legal, but it will be for each of us to find our own legal justification. And on that basis, they all voted yes, and more importantly, in February, March 1999, they actually voted for the decisions to launch the war. But they did so on the basis, pretty well most of them, of accepting the criteria I set out earlier on, which we put down as a paper in the North Atlantic Council, and most countries adhered to it. One country in particular didn't agree and acted in an exceedingly honorable way by saying that actually, while we don't agree, we're not going to stand against the action, but we will take our own measures to try and alleviate the humanitarian situation. And the cohesion of NATO was preserved throughout that, and indeed, 77 days later was stronger at the end than it had been at the beginning.
He's a very kind colleague, because the country that disagreed that was Greece.
Let me make two brief comments about that, because I think it's a terrific question. I think what a lot of people resent around the world, and I get the same reaction you do, is that the United States went to the United Nations. In fact, Bush gave a terrific speech in September 2002, but at the same time, they put our military in what we would call, from my days in government or my days on active duty, a use it or lose it position. So basically, you had so many Americans and British in the theater that you couldn't leave them there all summer. You were going to act regardless. The other, I think, that the big difference between us and the Europeans in general and other countries around the world, we have conflated. Terrorism is a tactic. We are not at war with terrorism. We're at war with a specific group. But by using this term terrorism, then you get yourself, doing a lot of things that really don't deal with the threat. And also other nations, say Russia in Georgia, can then say, we're fighting your battle here by going, or in Chechnya more particularly. And I think you have to be careful of that.
Thank you.
Can I add something to this? Please. Because I like the discussion. The case of Iraq, I think it's not very well explained, I would say, what happened in the Security Council. We were having the presidency of the European Union at the time, and I had to follow everything. So what I found is that there was no difference as far as the basic elements, if Saddam was a good or a bad one. The difference was in what kind of means we were going to use. And that is the big problem. And there, each one of us makes his own decision on here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming, and only whoever wants to answer can answer. I feel that a part of the right to intervene should be the staying power of the state that intervenes. We see a problem when nations, especially democracies like Spain, leave and march on March 11th from Iraq because, or at least it looks like to the international community, they left because they were attacked by al-Qaeda. Perhaps democracies shouldn't be allowed to intervene because they cannot maintain a grand strategy that, because their voting populace can vote whoever intervenes out of power, and then they have to leave. I feel that maybe if London were attacked, especially with the truce that Osama bin Laden offered on April 15th, if Europeans left Iraq, that if the Blair administration leaves power, as with an attack, that they might leave. So perhaps democracy shouldn't be allowed to intervene. Perhaps the UN should not be allowed to intervene because it just left Baghdad after one attack. What kind of force should be allowed to intervene?
Larry, that's for you.
Well, as I understand your question, you're talking about, you know, when you make the decision, should you follow the will of the people in your state, and what are the political consequences? I think it's interesting if you go and you look, for example, at the Muslim countries, in the countries in the Arab world that allowed us to use their bases to attack Iraq. I think if you had a vote in a lot of those countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, for example, what would the people have said? Would they have allowed that to happen? Turkey voted no, even though we wanted to go in there basically because they were democracy and the people did not. And there's no doubt about the fact that many people who joined this coalition, their populaces did not like that. Now you have to ask yourself, is that a failure of leadership? Is it a failure of communication? Or are the people, you know, essentially correct? And I think, by and large, that's why we have elections. And I think you get elected and you make your case, and if the people don't like it, then, you know, obviously you get voted out of office. Now, I am concerned, not from the sovereignty issue, that if a country joins the leadership following its constitutional procedures, and then you have a situation like you had in Spain, this will give heart to these terrorists with a global reach, to al-Qaeda. I mean, I think that's a bad precedent. But if you take a look at what happened, the ruling party wasn't honest with the people in the beginning when this attack occurred. You know, they basically blamed it on the Basques rather than al-Qaeda. And I thought it was interesting after that last bin Laden tape, when he basically said, you know, if you get out of Iraq and don't join with the United States, we'll leave you alone, that the opinion in countries like Italy, which had been opposed to their government getting involved, said, no, you know, we don't want to do that. So I think that is concern in the long term in terms of the struggle that we're waging against a group like al-Qaeda.
On this side.
Thank you. I'm a graduate student at City University of New York, PhD candidate in international relations, and thank you for having this forum. I want to problematize the notion of collective action, since all three of you seem to be enamored with the idea of collective action. It seems that there's a continuum of, on the one side, anarchy. You have a lot of neoconservatives and ultra-conservatives who don't think the UN should even exist. And there's, on the other side, you have another sort of, you know, globalization, world state idea, where you have, you know, pure collective action. So it seems that sovereignty must fit in there somehow, and all three of you agree that the world has changed. You know, the sovereignty is a bit problematic. So if you're right that, you know, economic boundaries have changed, we're in a globalized world, logically we have to have some sort of world government. Now, the UN isn't quite a world government, but do you think there should be one? Do you think the UN should be transformed into one? Do you think that it's even possible to have one? What are your positions on that?
I get to go first and let the others shoot at me again.
Sure.
Go ahead. I'm more than willing to defer to people who spend their time there.
Let me tell you one thing. The UN is not an organization like a big corporation where there is a CEO or there is a chairman and the president and they make decisions for the rest of the company. The UN is an organization, there is a Secretary General, but the Secretary General is following the will of the member states. And we start by the P5 and we go after all the others, and there is a Security Council. So let's not think that the UN is some kind of that will decide there is a crisis and the UN decides. This is exactly that what you have to have in mind. things is not so that way.
I think the UN has to be changed. It's not a world government, but it reflects the world as it existed in 1945, and that power distributions and things have changed. I mean, you've got to get somehow countries like India, Japan, Brazil, more of a role in making the major decisions. Now, that's easy for me to say because I don't know how to make it happen. I mean, because you're going to be basically telling countries, for example, like France, that you're not going to have the power that you used to in this organization. But I think if it doesn't change, it's not going to be as effective as it could be in dealing with these problems. And it has to. And you know, the international organizations that exist now basically were set up in 1945. The World Bank, IMF, all those things. And I think we really need to somehow or another take a look at changing these. And I would hope that the United States, as the major power in the world, would take the lead in trying to do something about this. Now, having said that, I think one big setback for the United States was not joining the International Criminal Court, because that would be a mechanism to deal with people who abuse their own people in the name of sovereignty, and this would be the world dealing with it. And I mean, I know why they did it. For the life of me, I don't understand why they did, but I mean, I know why it happened, and I happen to think only a Republican administration could make that happen, kind of the Nixon going to China thing.
UK too would lose its veto power.
No to world government, although increasingly regional organizations, groupings of country will assume a degree of supranationality, but not, I think, at the expense of the nation state. Yes, reform of the United Nations is due, although I do happen to think that the people who drafted the original charter, in the same way that the founding fathers of the European Union, they did a remarkably good job. And I think we have to be careful as we amend, because I'm conscious in Europe, the more we amend, the worse the text becomes. I think the founding fathers did rather better. But having a greater degree of legitimacy and be more modern isn't going to tackle one fundamental, which is, as the Greek ambassador said, what we're talking about is the will of nations to come together and take decisions. And unless there's political will among the nations to do some of the things we've been talking about, it's not going to happen. And it's unfair to blame the UN in all this. It's not the UN that's culpable. It's the lack of will by individual countries. I didn't comment on the earlier answer, but I would like to say on behalf of my Spanish colleagues that there's been so much rubbish written about the reaction of Spain. I would like to say that no country in Europe is more conscious of terrorism. No country has now that indigenous level of terrorism as Spain does with ETA. And if you look at Spain and where it's come from in the last 25 years, it's made huge progress. And if actually by democratic process it elects a government which takes a different view to its predecessor, I don't think that should count against Spain. I don't think it should argue that we should be hesitant about intervening because the democratic process might subsequently mean that we would stop intervening. It's the governments of the day who have the responsibility to take those responsibilities.
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you. I'm a third-year student here at Yale, at the law school, and I thank you for coming. Ambassador Parry spoke of the willingness to intervene and suggested that Liberia became a sub-regional contaminant because the world was unwilling to intervene when Charles Taylor was running roughshod over his people. People have suggested that other dynamics are at work here. And it has been said that Rwanda became a sub-regional contaminant for the same reason why Liberia became a sub-regional contaminant, which is the unwillingness of the world to intervene. And I'd like the panelists to comment on the suggestion that the world is has a tendency to ignore crisis in Africa. So does it make it an academic exercise to speak of a willingness to intervene when it's not applied on a consistent, in a consistent fashion? And in relation to that, a second question, Ambassador Parry also spoke of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. I'd like him specifically, and perhaps the other panelists, to comment on the role of that group vis-a-vis the Sudan, where atrocities of genocidal proportions are taking place right now.
Thank you very much for the question. To be clear, the Security Council spends, 50 to 60% of its time on Africa. We've probably got 6 or 7 peacekeeping operations in Africa, with another 2 imminent and possibly another 2 beyond that. I spend a lot of time in Africa, and in June we'll lead a delegation to West Africa. We owe it to the Africans, where the African Union, organizations like ECOWAS, which is the economic community for West African states, where they are working for solutions, it makes it, I think, even more incumbent upon us to support those efforts. Because in the end, the indigenous effort, the one which is supported by the neighbors, is more likely to succeed. But it's an obligation, I think, directly on the UN and on the non-African countries to support what the Africans are trying to do. In terms of Sudan, can I just say the UK is part of the 3 countries who are working that situation. Darfur and the situation there is acute. The whole problem of the peace negotiations affecting the South, we are at a point where I hope within the next couple of months we will actually end up with a settlement. If we have a settlement, and if that can wrap up also Darfur, the prospect of mounting a substantial and enduring peacekeeping operation in the Sudan is, in my view, essential. The UK will be arguing for that, and the UN is already planning for an operation which is more than just peacekeeping, but which tackles the need to build up the institutions, to cope with humanitarian situations, to do the policing, to be comprehensive in the response to the situation in the south of Sudan. And I hope in doing that, that we will improve as well a desperate situation which exists in the north of Uganda.
In view of the time, I would like to take just these last